Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this Friday afternoon. I'm Jonathan Rui, Director of Foreign Policy here at GINSA. I am pleased to moderate today's Rollout event for our new Gaza Futures Task Force. This is a joint project of GINSA and the Vandenberg Coalition, and today we will be discussing the task force's new report, The Day After, A Plan for Gaza. This task force convenes a group of former U.S. national security officials who served in both Republican and Democratic administrations to assess the impact of the October 7th terrorist attack, as well as strategies for establishing a post-Hamas future for Gaza that advances the interests of the United States, its key partners, the Palestinian people, and the cause of long-term stability and peace in the Middle East. I encourage everyone to visit ginsa.org to see the range of written materials this task force has produced, everything from an op-ed to an in-depth report with detailed findings and recommendations. Very quickly for our audiences, the Jewish Institute for National Security of America is an organization dedicated to advancing U.S. national security interests in the Middle East, a critical pillar of which is a robust U.S.-Israel security relationship. The Vandenberg Coalition is a 501c3 that believes American security depends on American leadership. Their mission is to arm elected leaders, candidates for federal office, the media, and the American people with expert insights to protect our prosperity and security and ensure we keep our enemies at bay. Before I begin today's discussion, I'd like to remind our audience to type any questions you may have into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, and I will do my best to address them all in turn. We're fortunate today to have 4 of the task force members as panelists. John Hanna, who chaired the group, is the Randy and Charles Wax Senior Fellow at GINSA's Gemunder Center for Defense and Strategy. He is also a member of Vandenberg's advisory board. Elliot Abrams is chairman of the Vandenberg Coalition. He is also Senior Fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Louis Libby is a former White House, Pentagon, and State Department national security official. He is also a member of Vandenberg's advisory board. And Rob Dineen is principal at Georgetown Global Strategies, as well as Middle East counselor at Dragoman. John, I'd like to start with you. Ask you to provide our audience with some background on the project itself, its genesis, its course of investigation, and a summary of some of our bottom line findings.
Okay, terrific. Thank you, Jonathan. And before I do say anything else, let me just personally acknowledge and thank you for the absolutely indispensable role that you played in support of this project in every single aspect. You did an amazing job, so thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to take 5 minutes to offer a few words of background on the project, and then I'll highlight a couple of key findings that I think provide important context for our specific plan for Gaza that other people will describe in detail. The task force consisted of 8 members, the 4 of us on this Zoom, as well as Steve Price and Gary Ginsberg, who both played an important role in bringing the group together, as well as Ambassador Eric Edelman and Emily Harding. Most of us have been colleagues in and out of government for the past 2 or 3 decades, if not longer in some instances. Some had worked only for Republican presidents. Some had worked for administrations of both parties. Politically, I'm not entirely sure how we break down, but I think it's something like 4 Republicans, 2 independents, 2 Democrats right now. We certainly tried to be as nonpartisan as we could in our approach. The group first convened on October 31st and went for 4 months, publishing our report on February 29th. The first 2 months almost entirely spent doing in-depth Zoom interviews with officials, former officials, military officers, diplomats, and other experts with relevant knowledge and experience from Israel, Gaza, people associated with the Palestinian Authority, several Arab states, the US, of course, and Europe. When we were all done, I think we conducted nearly 100 interviews in all. In December and January, subparts of our task force also took 2 trips to Israel and a trip to Saudi Arabia for high-level meetings with the Israeli government and the Saudi royal court. We also had a chance to share our plan with leaders in the UAE. Finally, we also briefed our recommendations to the Biden administration, both at the NSC and with Secretary Blinken and his team at the State Department. I'm not going to characterize the reactions of any specific government, except to say that as a general matter, we found real interest and engagement with our ideas. People were generally hungry for input, and I think appreciative of the fact that our ideas represented a degree of realism and out-of-the-box thinking that perhaps they weren't getting in a lot of their discussions about Gaza. We haven't heard anything like this before, was a reaction that I heard more than once, and I'm pretty sure in a good way, I should add. And since the report was issued, I have had some additional follow-up conversations from people in the administration and interest from Congress as well. Now, before we turn to the discussion of our specific proposal for Gaza, which is this idea of an international trust, let me just highlight a couple of the big findings that kind of framed our approach. At a 40,000-foot level, it's important to say, I think, that we believe it would be a mistake to view the current situation in Gaza in isolation. It's important to understand what's happening there is not just the latest round in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which at one level it certainly is, but as one part of a larger struggle that is being waged by two competing alliance systems seeking to define the future order of the Middle East. On the one hand, the Iranian-led alliance consisting of the Islamic Republic and its network of increasingly well-armed terrorist armies, of which Hamas is an important component, and a U.S.-led alliance system, on the other hand, that includes Israel and many moderate Sunni Arab states. Seen from that perspective, the war that Israel is waging is very much an integral part of the bigger strategic battle for influence and primacy that the United States is now engaged in against Iran in the first instance, but also with Iran's principal global backers in both China and Russia as well. And from that vantage point, Israel's struggle to defeat Hamas should be seen as vitally important to the United States, in no small part because it would represent, if successful, the first defeat ever for the proxy strategy that Iran has used to such devastating effect for the past 2 decades to attack and undermine U.S. interests and sow instability across the Middle East. And from that, I think it flowed for us that defeating Hamas is essential. It's essential to Israel, first and foremost, to restore its power, resilience, security, self-confidence, and national cohesion. It's essential to restoring Israel's broader deterrence in the region against Iran, Hezbollah, and the axis of resistance. It's also critical for giving Arab states renewed confidence that they can move forward with things like Israeli-Saudi normalization and the broader effort to construct a new political military coalition with the U.S. and Israel to combat and counter Iran. And finally, for Gaza and the Palestinians more generally, it should go without saying that absent an Israeli defeat of Hamas, it will be impossible to ever get to a day after or any hope for eventually building some kind of better Palestinian future. So with the importance of Israel's success against Hamas uppermost in our minds, we wanted to craft an approach that might help enable it and support it. In that regard, we very early on saw the potential for a humanitarian collapse in Gaza and the extremely powerful pressures it could generate for ending the war, both within the U.S. and internationally, as perhaps the greatest threat to Israel's ongoing campaign. All of us had had experience in government with past conflicts between Israel and Hamas or Israel and Hezbollah, particularly the 2006 war, and we're well aware of the way those international pressures could build and compel Israel to accept a ceasefire at a time that wasn't necessarily of its choosing. And whether we like it or not, and I think the news of recent weeks out of Gaza very much bears this out, the humanitarian crisis and the accelerating descent into anarchy are very much now a strategic factor in whether or not Israel will be able to sustain and maintain U.S. support for finishing the job against Hamas. Trying to address that reality, both to provide Israel with additional time and space and to ensure over time that any Israeli military success can be translated into a lasting political success was very much part of the thinking that went in to our specific recommendation that we ended up developing. The idea, again, of the international trust for Gaza relief and reconstruction, which I'll turn back to Jonathan and let him get my colleagues to go into greater detail about that.
Thank you, John. and I certainly want to get into the details of this trust, which is sort of the centerpiece recommendation of our report. But in mirroring the report itself, I think it's important first to sort of discuss. There's certainly been no shortage of alternatives proposed for the day after in Gaza, and in fact, many of them were preceded ours. But I'd like to turn now to Elliot and ask him to discuss the task force's thinking and reflections on why many of the other proposals for a Gaza day after were unwise or unrealistic, as we put it. Sorry, Elliot, you're muted.
That was not that hard a task, in that some of the ideas immediately present the downside. The notion that Israel should remain in Gaza should, in a certain sense, go back to the days when it ran Gaza after the '67 war, should commit, half its army in the face of a population that would presumably be quite resistant to this. Just seemed like a very bad idea to most Israelis, but it seems like a very bad idea to us as well. The solution is not simply to say the Israelis have to take care of this now permanently. Same easy conclusion, I think, on the part when it comes to the United States. One has to assume that there will be both a humanitarian, which is to say immediate humanitarian, and then reconstruction element, and there will be a security element. And Scooter Libby will talk about that soon. No one, I think, would come easily to the conclusion that these tasks should be adopted by the United States. And our government has very much emphasized, as we talk about building a pier to accept goods coming from Larnaca, emphasized that there would be no boots on the ground. Politically in the United States, I think it would be quite unacceptable, and rightly so, that the United States should undertake this task, or should even lead, should be the country that is responsible for the future economy and security of Gaza. Now, others have suggested Egypt. Again, that falls pretty quickly. The Egyptians, first of all, don't have the wherewithal they don't have the money to rebuild Gaza or to feed the people of Gaza, nor do they want to do so. And their incredible sensitivity, even to taking a few thousand Gazans into Egypt, in a temporary refugee camp, a refugee camp for children or for women or for the elderly. They've rejected all of that. So the notion that the Egyptians would take this on, I think, fails. And then you go to the PA. There's no doubt for many, many people that the PA needs to have a role. In UN terms, it's the, quote, sole legitimate authority for the Palestinian people. And we think it does have a role, a small one, in blessing whatever happens in Gaza, which is useful in UN terms. But again, just think of the resource question. The PA is unable to keep order in the West Bank. The fight against terrorism in the West Bank is substantially the work of the Israeli defense and intelligence forces. And the PA is perennially broke. Think of the task of providing humanitarian goods, food mostly, now, just in April. The PA has simply no way to do that. It's also lacking legitimacy today to rule Gaza. Polls are taken very frequently of Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank, and the PA today lacks that ability and legitimacy. We hear all about revamping and revitalizing and deradicalization. Well, the PA has not undertaken any of that. We can debate whether it will someday undertake any of that, whether it is serious about undertaking any of that, but the notion that it is in a position simply to change its spots overnight and then take on the task of providing humanitarian relief rebuilding Gaza, rebuilding a government, providing security, I think again, it simply falls of its own weight. That is what left us thinking that we ought to try to come up with something else that involves governments and organizations that have competence, that have money in some cases, that can make a serious effort with the humanitarian, political, and security situation in Gaza.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to Scooter now to delve into some of the main features of this International Trust for Gaza Relief and Reconstruction, as we officially title it in our proposal. So I guess, Scooter, if you could start off, when most people hear the word trust, and I've had this come up in discussions, they immediately turn to thinking about the UN. I think it's the first word most people associate, which is clearly not our proposal. So I think for our audience, it'd be helpful if you could start off and explain just what the main features of our trust would be, I guess, before we then delve into some of its more specific activities.
Thank you, Jonathan. The trust, as you point out, is not a UN creation. It would be an entity created by donor states, states that are willing to provide assistance. It's a trust, in short, not a trusteeship. It does not require UN approval of some form or some form of international agreement. It's simply a trust dedicated to a humanitarian mission, and therefore, we believe relatively easy for states with the resources, as Elliot points out, to contribute to it. Like other trusts, it would have a board, presumably created by the state or states that first set up the trust as a private entity. And that board would have officers and staff who help it conduct its mission. Now, what would that mission be? It would be to provide relief, humanitarian relief at the front part, including not just food and water, but to help us reestablish services. And I say help because it does not have an international mandate to run Gaza. It is an entity that would help people do it, including local Gazans who are interested in having their power turned back on and the like. Then it would work towards, after humanitarian aid and services, it would be free to work on governance or other issues like that to help the Gazans govern themselves if there are Gazans who are willing to step up to the plate. And they could do that through education efforts, through deradicalization, through training and specialization, the sorts of things that non-government offices do all the time. It was obvious to us, and I think increasingly obvious to the world, that in a fraught situation, a war zone situation such as Gaza, it's very difficult to deliver aid into a country and have it get to the people who it's designed to help. In this particular situation, it's quite likely that Hamas would continue to try and take aid to the extent it's able for its own purposes, raise revenue, or favor its own forces or others. Or just chaos would occur, just as it has in other places where international aid has come in. So it was clear to us from the beginning that the board of the trust would have to secure some security services in order to ensure that if the environment required it, that aid could be delivered safely. And that help could come from governments that are interested in providing forces, either from the region or from outside the region. For reasons that Elliot went into, our analysis was that that's going to be a very limited set of states that are willing to put forces in without such restrictive rules of engagement that they become more of a problem and hindrance than success. And so it was likely that the trust would have to augment, if not have the main burden of its services provided through private contracting, which we can go into later, but which has proven successful in the last decade.
Thank you. Yeah, obviously plenty of these issues we'll want to turn to in the back half of our hour, but I'd like to turn to Rob now and sort of address, to some extent, elephant in the room, which is the Palestinian Authority. Obviously, it's come up in the comments so far here and there, but Rob would love to have you address for our audience. I mean, First of all, I guess your own thoughts, if you'd like to expand upon what we've already said about why the current PA would not be a viable option for running Gaza.
Sure. Well, thank you. Well, Elliot spoke to some of it. I mean, point out the legitimacy deficit that exists today, the capacity deficit that exists today, that the Palestinian Authority security forces can't control the West Bank. So the idea that they would be introduced to Gaza right now, is fanciful. And we did meet with the USSC that is on the ground, that trains the Palestinian security forces. It will take time to, even if the decision were taken today, to train, equip, and introduce Palestinians into Gaza that could handle it. Not to mention the fact that their reception is, questionable. I mean, they lost Gaza in 2007. So that would be a challenge without a proper political framework within the Palestinian politics, which gets to a big problem that exists today, that is endured for a great deal of time, which has been the fundamental divide between the West Bank and Gaza, not just physically, but politically. Ever since Hamas took over the PA government in 2007, you've had two rival governments, neither of which recognize nor really want to reconcile with one another. And that dilemma, if you will, has not been resolved. There's been an effort, there have been a number of efforts to try to set up independent, technocratic governments to try to unify these two entities, or at least establish, nonpartisan polities, if you will, that could unify, or at least start to do so, the two entities. That was in part what the push for reform has been, and the call for a reconstituted Palestinian Authority. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem that that's exactly the path that the Palestinians are on. One of the problems at the moment is that yes, there's a push both from the West and also from within the Arab world and amongst the Palestinians for the Palestinian Authority to reform. The problem is now, in essence, we're, Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of Palestine, the PA, Fatah, is now being asked to sort of police himself or clean up his own act. Well, without any real checks and balances, without any real if you will, greater accountability. And we can talk about recent developments there that are not encouraging, frankly, along that path.
Thank you, Rob. Just a quick follow-up before we do a more round-robin version of Q&A. Rob, I'd like to we've sort of touched upon it again in some of the other remarks so far, but to sort of drill down on sort of straight on this question of, it seems like there may be a sort of a rush on the political level, at least, to try to make quick progress toward a path for a two-state solution, I guess is what it's being called. And in the report, we talk about how there needs to be a political horizon, it needs to be that. It needs to be a horizon. Could you delve into a little bit more of why we phrase it that way, why a more precipitous rush would be counterproductive?
Sure. I mean, that's right. Look, everyone we spoke to, we recognize, we're pragmatic. We recognize that in order for there to be greater buy-in, for there to be a process moving forward that brings the Israelis and Palestinians together, brings the Arab states, that brings the West, that there needs to be a sense that this is, that reconstituting Gaza is not just a prelude to another round of fighting and destruction, that this actually, something better needs to emerge from this. And the consensus has been, for the large part, a Palestinian state, a two-state solution. The United States first explicitly called for it in 2002, George Bush. And it's been U.S. policy ever since. The trick is, or the fly in the ointment is, how do you get there, and what does it mean to get to a Palestinian state? subsequent administrations have always focused on getting the parties to negotiate. Fine, that needs to happen, but they need to negotiate when they're legitimate, when they have the legitimacy to actually make compromises at the table, and they have the capacity their institutionally to actually to move forward, which is not the case today. And so, in essence, what we're saying, and I've been a long-term advocate of preparing the groundwork and capacity for the parties to be in a position to actually, meaning the Palestinians, to actually sit down, negotiate a state with legitimate institutions, with unified polity, and so it has to be part of a larger process. There's an additional factor, which is the timing. To unfortunately, calling for a Palestinian state right now has had a boomerang effect politically, in the sense that we didn't really consult to date the administration with the Israelis about that, and so if anything, we've helped unify the Israelis to a sense of, wait a minute, we were attacked on October 7th, and the outcome is going to be a Palestinian state. Now, the polling suggests that a majority of Israelis are opposed to this. That's true. Polls are good snapshots of moments in time. As a long-term observer of this process, I believe that that's as far as they go. So what it tells you is now is not the time. It doesn't mean that it can't be, those numbers can change on both the Israeli and Palestinian sides. They have changed dramatically up and down, but not in the middle of a war. So there's a statecraft element here that I think has not been very effective, in the sense that we almost have guaranteed by the way that we've pursued this that there is not an Israeli buy-in to this, and there has to be. Which is not to say that I'm sanguine. I believe that in the end, Israelis and Palestinians can be brought to that result, but not in the middle of a war.
Thank you, Rob.
Could I,
Elliot, if there's anything you want to add, yeah.
Yeah, before we go to the Q&A, and I'll try to be brief, but we started thinking about the security aspect of this very early on. And a couple of the things that we mentioned were the idea that some donor states might provide forces. That's first. And we didn't mean by that somebody would say, I'm going to send my army in, nor would that be desirable. But it is noticeable already that there are occasions in which donors setting up, for example, a kind of tent city or refugee camp have policed it. Just that area. But of course, as you think about Gaza and the need for, tent cities and prefab housing villages, if the donors, particularly Arab donors, were willing to provide security, and on a small scale, this appears to be happening, that is a piece of the answer. We also talked initially with experts, Israeli and Arab experts, about this idea of clans, of what known as hamulas, which were superseded really by the Hamas governance by force, but didn't disappear because they're tribal in nature. And we now see in the news that the Israelis are making an effort to work with groups, tribal groups or clan groups, I think is probably a better word, and even groups of businessmen. So these are not simply imaginary possibilities. They're possibilities that actually are already being tried on the ground, and which we mentioned in the report as contributing factors to an overall security solution. There's no magic wand to wave, and it will be messy. But some of the things that we talk about in the report are beginning to happen.
So before we go into the second half of the hour we have here, just a reminder to our audience, if you have any questions for the panelists, please type them into the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. We will do our best to get to them. So Scooter, I'd like to turn back to you because I want to get to the, this issue of private security contractors. And as we're seeing now, the issue of how to get humanitarian aid, sort of metaphorically or literally that last mile into Gaza to ensure that it's distributed equitably. I'd like to get your assessment on sort of, obviously the headlines right now are dominated by news of airdrops and temporary reports. Could you go a little bit more into sort of, do you think these are a step in the right direction? And then what would be a complementary role for our trust as we described it?
Well, the trust is infinitely flexible and could provide aid through any of these mechanisms, including most notably trucking. I believe that the Israeli government, I believe with some reason that the Israeli government would be amenable if there were responsible trusts such as the one we're talking about, helping to deliver aid to the right recipients, helping to protect the process, that the Israeli government would be very open on helping get trucking get across the borders. And I believe they've already had some difficulty getting things in. This could be assisted by the trust. Whether the port is a practical way to do this, not clear to me. I do not have the benefit of the analysis that they have. Airdrops and the port seem a rather the first small and relatively high cost, and the second sort of delayed. It's my way of thinking, but I'm not the expert on the logistics of delivering this particular aid into the country. In the abstract, I would have thought trucks are the most efficient way to get it done, and that would be perfectly consistent with trust, which has worked with the local community, which provides security from the time the goods reach outside of Gaza, are examined to be sure that they're safe and don't have contraband, and then transit in with the assistance of the trust. So at the end of the final 30 yards of it could be, in fact, worked by the clans, as Elliot described, or by other forms of workers.
So to stick on this theme of aid distribution, because it's so relevant both in the headlines but also central to our report. Elliot, I'd like to ask you this question first, but then open up to the rest of the group if they'd like. The UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, has a lot of infrastructure in the Palestinian territories. Could you explain for our audiences what our proposed role is for UNRWA in all of this in terms of aid distribution and the longer term future, even if long term doesn't mean long term, for UNRWA in Gaza?
Well, I think the answer is as small as possible. There's an argument that some of what UNRWA does can't be changed overnight. It certainly can be changed over time. Witness the fact that, at least according to press reports I've seen, already more food is being distributed in Gaza by the World Food Program than by UNRWA. And that was not true, let's say, January 1st, much less last year. So when you think about things like food distribution, both how it gets in from outside, who secures it around the world, who pays for it. In the United States, for example, is about to deliver a lot of flour. UNRWA is not essential. It may have some narrow roles that can be replaced only over time. UNRWA runs schools. It runs them badly. It runs them with Hamas-affiliated teachers. It runs them by inculcating hatred of Israel and Jews and Christians, for that matter. Well, somebody's going to have to run those schools, and it shouldn't be UNRWA, but it's not clear to me whether that can take place in March or when exactly it can take place. So I think I'd say our view of UNRWA is that for practical reasons and ideological reasons, it should be replaced in Gaza as soon as that is practical, and it should be a task of all those who are helping in Gaza, and in our view, it should be the task of the trust to make those arrangements so that international bodies, private voluntary organizations, NGOs, other UN agencies, UNICEF, World Food Program, can do what, in many cases, they do quite well, instead of UNRWA, which does it poorly.
So I'd like to turn it to John next. So in our discussions of the trust and the particulars of Gaza itself, we all contextualize it, situate it in the report in this larger need for a regional strategy, for a regional context. So John, could you explain for our audiences, the day after in Gaza is one thing, but how do we deal with Iran on the day after, to put it in the phraseology of one of our questions? Because everything we talk about in Gaza is obviously part of this larger regional context. So I think, could you delve more for our audience into that larger regional aspect of the report and our recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, we urge in the report that people think about Gaza and what we do there in this larger context, this larger struggle that we're in against the Iranian axis of resistance. And we see this obviously most clearly that since October 8th, more or less, all of Iran's other proxies, as soon as October 7th happened, have gotten into this fight, clearly trained, funded, supplied with increasingly advanced armaments by the Islamic Republic. So everything, including October the 7th, that has happened over the last 4 months in terms of attacks on Israel, attacks on U.S. forces, attacks against maritime shipping in the Red Sea, all are being orchestrated and have a hand behind them of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps that we have to be very mindful of. And we have to obviously be thinking more broadly about how we are going to counter going forward. Immediately in the case, as I say, in Gaza, that means that Hamas and Iran's proxy strategy has to be defeated in Gaza. That will be an important inflection point historically, because Iran hasn't, and its proxy strategy haven't suffered that kind of defeat before. But very quickly, we're going to have to, and I think that will be important for the Northern Front, where Israel right now has dedicated, I don't know, probably close to half of its forces, having to think about, this current relatively low-level skirmishes, but very worrisome and risky skirmishes with Hezbollah that are going on right now, that have depopulated, I don't know, 80,000, 100,000 people out of Israel's northern towns and villages along the Lebanese border. How do you deter that from turning into a much broader war? How do you get Hezbollah and specifically its Radwan forces to back away from that border, so those Israeli people, those exiles that have fled, can get back into their communities? That'll be a critical question that we can't take our eye off the ball. What happens in Gaza will be important for that, but so will, really keeping focused on leaving very little daylight between Israel and the United States, to be sending a very clear message to Hezbollah that it can either try and resolve this issue of the Radwan forces diplomatically through these efforts by the U.S. administration and the French, or we will be supportive of an Israeli effort to solve it militarily, because the current situation on the border is just no longer tolerable for Israel after October the 7th. The other thing I'd say is obviously, to the extent we can be successful in Gaza and build some kind of platform in Gaza for successful cooperation with the Arabs, I do think that has a potential, and we should think about it as a springboard for getting back on track with Israeli-Saudi normalization first, and then the broader coalition that we're hoping to build that involves Israel, the United States, and some of these moderate Sunni Arab states. I think that'll be a very powerful blow against the Iranians. Personally, I believe that October 7th, at least in terms of the specific timing, that the Iranians and the axis of resistance were getting extremely nervous about the progress that was being made on Israeli-Saudi normalization in particular, because I do think they see it as a very dangerous thing for them, first and foremost ideologically, to have the the world's leading Islamic and Arab state reconciling in some kind of peace agreement with the world's only Jewish state, that's a real problem for the axis of resistance, and something that I think they're greatly afraid of. So I think we need to very much continue working on that. And then finally, of course, the Iranian nuclear program continues to loom over everything. People are been distracted from it because of the war in Gaza. It's not exactly clear to me what the Iranians are doing to continue advancing that program, but I have little doubt that they're probably working away at that. So all of those things, it's a lot on our plate, but it can't just be Gaza alone. There's going to be a day after elsewhere against the Iranian axis as well.
Just a quick follow-up for you, John. We heard a lot, and I don't think it's perhaps fully appreciated here in the States. When we were in Israel as part of this project, we heard a lot about Israel being on a war footing, and what that means for the country strategically, but also socially and economically going forward. Could you shed a little bit of light for our audience on some of our takeaways from our trips there after October 7th in terms of perhaps Israel's new sense of security and its willingness to maintain a larger military force and sort of re-envision its sort of military and defense industrial efforts going forward, given the need that even if and when Hamas is defeated, that's only one element of this larger problem you described.
I could try and touch on it. Rob and Elliot probably can speak to this better than I can. I did get, October 7th, my impression, particularly from our December visit, that this was a real inflection point in history. This was not for Israelis just the latest round of an endless cycle of violence with Palestinians. This was something really major, the darkest day and the most violent day in the country's history. And a lot has changed after that. I think there was a perception amongst a lot of people in the Israeli security establishment that their, traditional national security doctrine based on whatever early warning and deterrence and, immediately taking the fight to the enemy and whatnot, that a lot of that, has been put into question, and they need to think again anew about their posture, including things like, the necessity potentially of preemption, obviously keeping a much larger, potentially standing army in places like up against that northern border or down by the Gaza envelope. I think Israelis are feeling like United States has been pretty good in resupplying us, but we don't ever want to be in the position where we might be falling short in terms of our munitions and having to really ration our munitions, because we're now fighting on multiple fronts potentially. So I think you're going to see changes in the Israeli defense industrial base. I think that's a good thing, probably, especially if it can be done in close cooperation with the United States, that also has deep problems in its defense industrial base, and is going to need our allies really pitching in on that to move forward against the Chinese and Russians both. But why don't I don't know if Elliot or Rob have additional thoughts on the impact
Rob,
in
go
Israel.
ahead. Rob?
I don't have much to add on this specific topic. I'll, for the sake of time.
I won't either. I think John's quite right, and we are what in the 6th month of the war now, which by Israeli standards is astonishing.
Yeah.
Once there was a 6-day war, and the Lebanon War of 2006 was, if I remember correctly, 34 days. So this is a shock to the Israeli system, and it will. I mean, I think they realized. We heard people say in the first weeks of the war that they're going to need a larger army, and needing a larger army has forced them to confront the fact that 60,000 military-age males who are exempt from the draft now, the ultra-Orthodox men, may need to be drafted into some form of national service, if not into the military. So this is a very deep change in Israeli society.
Actually, I would like to just add one thing.
Please, Rob, yeah.
Building on Elliot's point, I mean, recall in the very immediate aftermath of October 7th, the United States deployed a carrier group to the Eastern Mediterranean. This had a profound effect in Israel in many ways. Obviously, the Israeli people and the Israeli leadership were very grateful for it and appreciated it, and it was a clear demonstration of support and an effort to deter others from joining into the fight. But we did also hear from the Israeli establishment, I think it was also a bit sobering for them, because it goes up against, they have such a deeply ingrained sensibility of, needing to defend themselves by themselves. And the idea that they may have actually needed that. Plus what John was talking about earlier, the realization that their supply lines are not infinite and that there are limitations and are constraints and difficulties. I think the defense establishment, for sure, as well as some of the society at large, is grappling with that and going to grapple with that. October 7th was quite a wake-up call in that regard, that really, in a sense, humbled them and has forced them to recognize that they're not as necessarily as able to fight on as many fronts as they may need to at any given time. I'd also like to say just one thing about the trust itself, because it's come up in some of the questions on the leaderboard, or whatever we call it. And it's an important point, and my colleagues will correct me if I get this wrong. But I think it's really important, we especially were writing the report and preparing it amidst a flurry of diplomatic effort in which the administration and others are looking at everything from not just a two-state solution, but also trying to pivot towards a regional peace agreement, and really trying to, what we've heard called a Hail Mary, in able to really, at one extreme, turn this crisis and horrific event and set of events and war into a better Middle East. That's at one extreme. And at the other extreme, there's an effort just to deal with the immediate humanitarian disaster, not to, for Israelis and Palestinians both. And I think what's important about the trust is, in a way, it's agnostic. It's something that can be used and immediately now, while some of these larger aspirations and goals are being sorted out. And to some extent, the debates about some of those issues, like the Palestinian state debate now, as well, about the Palestinian Authority, in some sense, what we were saying earlier is that they're theoretical debates, because they're not about to happen today under any circumstances. And that's where the trust, in a way, no matter where you want to go, it doesn't preclude anything, but it provides an immediate solution to some real immediate needs.
Thank you, Rob. And to that point where, we talk about the trust being agnostic, in some sense, it also, we talk about it as an immediate and an interim solution, but we also talk about it in the larger context of this need for de-radicalization. And so I want to sort of bundle a couple of the questions we've got from our audience here. I guess, Elliot, I'll pose this to you first and then open up to the task force. The questions are, how likely is it the influence of Hamas could be eradicated in Gaza as a political ideology, but then sort of using that as an intro into the larger question about our report, which is, how do we propose addressing the issue of de-radicalization, both in Gaza, but also the West Bank?
People have said, not flippantly, that the idea that you can't defeat an ideology is disproved by the Nazi case, where the United States crushed Germany, crushed the Nazi leadership, and helped rebuild a democratic Germany. I think the first task for the Israelis is to defeat Hamas militarily and remove it from power as a governing power anywhere in Gaza. That defeat will certainly lead a lot of people in Gaza and in the West Bank who may have been supporters of Hamas to rethink where Hamas has led the Palestinian people. Remembering also that, Hamas has never had, I think it's fair to say, majority support. It had plurality support in the 2006 election, 44 to 41% of the votes against Fatah. So there are plenty of Palestinians who were never supporters of Hamas. But there's no substitute here for defeating them as a military power and removing them as a government of Gaza. Yes, there is this ideology. It's the Muslim Brotherhood ideology. It exists all over the Middle East. It is not possible to go into people's heads and change their thoughts. It is possible to show them what those thoughts lead to. And that is what the Israelis, with a good deal of American support, are showing in Gaza. Now, how do you de-radicalize? This is not something that has to be thought of as being on the moon. The Moroccans, the Emiratis, the Saudis are engaged in these efforts now. There are groups that review annually textbooks and have reported annually on the change in Saudi textbooks as they deliberately and carefully squeeze out the anti-Semitism. We've seen this in the Emirates as well. We've seen in Morocco a concentration on training of young imams who represent a more enlightened version of Islam that is not filled with hate of Christians and Jews and doesn't teach that. So these are not things that have never been tried anywhere. They have been tried. And if you look at Saudi Arabia and the Emirates in the last, let's say, 10 years, they're happening, they're working. And that is what is needed in Gaza. What is being said in the mosques and what is being taught in the schools has to change. And that's the beginning. It won't be overnight because people have had, Hamas took over in 2007. That's a generation of hatred, a generation of Gazans raised, being taught these hateful things. So training a new generation will take years. But the way to start, obviously, is to prevent the teaching of hate in schools and in mosques.
Thank you. So in the few minutes we have left, I want to try to tie together a few more questions, staying on the theme of potentially longer term efforts that do need to start now. Scooter, I'd like to ask you to address the issue of, as it's phrased in our questions, Gaza made some impressive strides in infrastructure in the 90s. Considering the scale of destruction and displacement during this war, how long could it take to rebuild Gaza as a quasi-functioning society? We use the word reconstruction in our report, and that's obviously a word that would imply a large-scale, perhaps long-term project.
So let me divide this into two different parts of an answer. One part is physical. The other part is governance and society. Physical reconstruction of damaged areas has been shown in other cases to be quite possible. The burden in Gaza, as great as the damage is within Gaza, it's a small area compared to Western Europe, for example, after World War II. So functioning elements can be introduced relatively rapidly for the beginning of a normal life. But the real question is, where will the people be? What will be left of Hamas and radicals who are seeking to disrupt it? Because there's no question in our mind, at least, that if Hamas sees the end of the road, the remnants of Hamas will go after the people who are trying to step in as governance, and it will be a vicious environment if they have anything to say about it. So there will have to be some way of getting past that. Then, as Elliot was getting into, we have to remember that for 17 years, Hamas has been in charge of pouring propaganda into the heads of all the students, control of the media, radicalizing the population, conducting activities such as what we're seeing now, in which they provoke Israeli attacks in order to cause casualties among Gazans, in order to increase the hatred among Gazans. Now, that was under Hamas. Before, it was under Fatah, and it was not a perfect record then, as you know. So this is a long period for a society to be, in effect, brainwashed by hatred. Overcoming that, getting Gazans who are willing to step up, who will have to be brave. And there's little question in my mind that when a Gazan steps forward to say, I want to be a part of a post-Hamas government, a government that's willing to improve the lives of the people, that's willing to see the youth of the country not be perverted, that's willing to be done with Hamas-type leadership, those people will be at risk. And they will require not just an intellectual commitment, but courage on their part. As reconstruction has required courage among people throughout history. It's not that we're asking the Gazans to do something that other people have not done after tyrannical regimes. So in the end, the question will be how many of them are willing to step forward? And that, I would say, is the $24 million question. Our chairman, John Hanna, and the members who are on this call were all rigorous during our portion of speaking to experts in these many, many interviews we had to try and get a sense of what is on the ground in Gaza. If the boot of Hamas were removed from the throat of the people, what do they really think? Some of the polling is bad on this point.
Yeah.
And if the majority of the people want a radical regime that will not live in peace with Israel and that seeks to kill Israelis, it's a tough future ahead for them and for Israel having to live next to them. So there is a big question here. What will they say? They may agree with, they may not like Israel. They may agree with what's been poured into them over 17 years. But it's another thing to know that you've been held out as a human shield, to know that your sister or daughter is dead because Hamas put a firing unit in their building. And hopefully that will break through, as we have seen some indication in some videos slipping out of Gaza.
Yeah.
Some of these people do recognize that Hamas has put them in the firing line cynically and for Hamas's own purposes, while, as they say, hey, the tunnels are for us. It's for other people to protect Gazans. That's a very strange reaction from an entity that's been governing a society for 17 years.
Well, I think with those remarks and something like a ray of light at the end of this tunnel, I think it's as good a place to stop as any. I'd like to thank all our panelists for joining us today and for all their service on this task force, which, as we mentioned at the outset, has certainly been rigorous in every phase of this project and will be ongoing. So I encourage our audience to stay tuned to JINSA and the Vandenberg Coalition for further output on this front. So thank you again to our panelists. Thank you to our audience for joining on this Friday afternoon. And thank you to the Vandenberg Coalition for their partnership with JINSA in making all of this possible. And I'd refer everyone again to jinsa.org for the full-length report, the brief executive summary of the report, and also an action plan that describes the trust and which we use in our briefings before this rollout. Thank you all again and have a great weekend.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.